that the brain has a role in this control of inflammation. And what it does is that it sends signals down the vagus nerve. Vagus nerves run on each side of your neck, and these signals travel down your neck and into your immune system, particularly the spleen, where these signals have the ability to turn off inflammation. And so the brain and the vagus nerve are acting like the brakes in your car to slow down inflammation and prevent it from spinning out of control and causing damage.
Welcome back to the MedTech 101 podcast. And today it's something also quite exciting, like most episodes we have on this podcast when it comes to technology and how it interacts with the human body to solve issues that we face on a regular basis. And today I'm joined by Kevin Tracey, who is the president of the Feinstein Institute for Medical Research. And he's been doing quite a lot of work for more than 3 decades there, so it's quite exciting to see what we're going to learn today. But before we even go on with the introductions and everything, welcome on the podcast, Doc.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here.
Thank you. The honor is mine. So just to get started, really, I know you've been working for years on this, and like when it comes to pain management, essentially, finding a way to handle pain by basically stimulating certain nerves in the human body. Before we get to that exciting part, like what could you tell us about your background? Leading to where you are.
I have spent the last 40 years or so studying inflammation. I'm a neurosurgeon. I graduated medical school and pursued neurosurgery training some years ago and combined my interest in neurosurgery and inflammation about 25 years ago around the idea that inflammation in its own right is a good thing, but too much inflammation in the body can actually be a serious problem. And if you ask the question, if too much inflammation can cause conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, then how did mammalian evolution deal with this? And the answer, it turns out, comes from the fact that inflammation is beneficial when it occurs in small amounts and does not persist too long, and when it resolves normally. And what we learned, my colleagues and I in the laboratory at the Feinstein Institutes about 25 years ago, we learned that the brain has a role in this control of inflammation. And what it does is that it sends signals down the vagus nerve. Vagus nerves run on each side of your neck, and these signals travel down your neck and into your immune system, particularly the spleen, where these signals have the ability to turn off inflammation. And so the brain and the vagus nerve are acting like the brakes in your car to slow down inflammation and prevent it from spinning out of control and causing damage. And that was the beginning, really, of an idea that maybe we could start a company called SetPoint Medical to develop a device which they call an immunoregulator, which just 10 days ago, the FDA approved SetPoint's product to stimulate the vagus nerve to treat inflammation. And so this really ushers in a new era, if you will, of using what we call bioelectronic devices to treat inflammation instead of drugs.
Well, that's really exciting, really, and congratulations for the FDA approval. It's I'm sure it took years for people listening to this podcast or this episode right now. It takes almost maybe 10 years, sometimes in certain cases, for a product to go from concept to market. And by market is when you get the approval for you to be able to sell it on the market. So it's quite exciting. But you mentioned something that's really exciting there, Doc, and you mentioned that pain can be regulated without using pain, and that's what a lot of the work that you guys have been doing. And so then this sort of like links to essentially bioelectric, like sort of like medicine, essentially, where you are working to find alternatives to taking pharmaceutical drugs for some things that affect people chronically. So like what could you tell us in terms of like what actually biomedicine is, and how it works? And but even, or perhaps you could even tell us more about the Feinstein Institute of Medical Research, where you guys are based, and what else you're doing there before you go and tell us more details about what bioelectric medicine is.
The Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research is the home for research at Northwell Health in New York. Northwell Health is a healthcare system comprised of more than 25 hospitals, 110,000 employees that treat 2.5 million patients every year all across New York City, the greater New York City area, up into Connecticut. And this network of healthcare providers is also quite committed to, in addition to providing great medical care, also very focused on providing a research environment that can be innovative and help produce the next generation of science and of medical therapies. And so we put our researchers together into what we call the Feinstein Institutes. There's about 100 laboratories that employ about 1,000 full-time team members. In addition, we collaborate very, very closely with thousands and thousands of clinical researchers that work across our hospitals, our outpatient clinics, and our other patient care facilities. We're a very collaborative, cohesive group. We work together to solve problems ranging from across the medical spectrum, from whether it's molecular medicine, where we look at basic disease mechanisms and develop experimental therapeutics, all the way up to behavioral health and addressing questions in the fields of psychiatry and mental health, into big data, looking at what we call health system science, looking at healthcare decision making and how that links to outcomes and behaviors. We have a strong interest in cancer research. We work very closely with the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is an esteemed National Cancer Institute designated center that we collaborate very closely with. And we have a lot of interest and expertise in what we call bioelectronic medicine. Now to define that, it's best to think of it as an example. If you were a pharmaceutical company, you would and wanted to make a new therapy, you would go through a process. You would begin by picking the disease or the condition, and then move to identifying or discovering or studying the molecular mechanism of that condition. And once you agree on the molecular mechanism, then you move to developing drugs or therapeutics that hit that molecular target like lock and key, and then you screen them and test them and sell them. Now, that is the model for drug discovery and development that goes back to Paul Ehrlich in the beginning of the 20th century. With bioelectronic medicine, we take a different approach. With bioelectronic medicine, we pick a disease or condition and identify the molecular mechanism, the molecular target that is at the heart of the pathogenesis. But then rather than screen for molecules as therapeutics, we study neural signals that produce neurotransmitters that can modulate the molecular target in situ, in life. And now, if you know how to modulate the molecular target through the signals that travel in nerves, you can think about building devices to control the nerves, to either turn them up or turn them down. And now the device becomes the therapy because it's driving signals that drive the neurotransmitters that control the molecular target. And that's basically what we've now done for the condition rheumatoid arthritis, where we can drive signals with a small device called an immunoregulator made by SetPoint Medical, the company that I co-founded in 2007. SetPoint Medical's device stimulates fibers in the vagus nerve that travel down to the spleen and lead to an increased release of a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. This acetylcholine is the molecule that hits the target on the white blood cells called the alpha-7 receptor. And this alpha-7 receptor is the switch that turns off the white blood cells from becoming inflamed. It actually causes the white blood cells to convert from being an inflamed state to a tissue healing or tissue reparative state. And so now you have, because of this device that switches these cells into a tissue reparative state, these cells can travel from the spleen through the bloodstream to the hands or the joints where the arthritis is and actually calm it down and actually turn the disease around. And that's what we're seeing happen now.
Well, that's amazing. That's amazing, and I'm really quite impressed by the method of how it works, and it's actually quite exciting. And to think that there's actually now the modern day reality of where we live in a world where maybe some of us are just tired of taking pharmaceutical drugs for certain conditions we live with. This is exciting news, and I couldn't help but ask: is it only applicable to arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, or there's also have other applications as well with other illnesses, or you have to say it's only rheumatoid arthritis because that's what you guys filed for your FDA application. What could you tell
So,
us, Doc?
so that's correct. The FDA application was specifically for patients with rheumatoid arthritis who are either not responding to the drugs they're currently taking, powerful immunosuppressive drugs like biologics, or what are called the JAKs or the JAK inhibitors. If patients have rheumatoid arthritis and are not responding to those drugs, then they may be eligible for the FDA approved device called an immunoregulator from SetPoint. And that's what's new. I mean, this is just 10 days old. However, all of us involved in this fully expect there will be much more work and many more indications coming in the coming years. And the reason we say this is because there's an overwhelming amount of evidence from laboratory studies and even from some clinical studies that by driving these vagus nerve signals to suppress inflammation, it's possible to reverse inflammation in conditions ranging from rheumatoid arthritis to inflammatory bowel disease to multiple sclerosis, even to conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, um, cerebral vascular ischemia or stroke, and diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, and there's even some ongoing work looking at some kinds of cancer. So you're going to see a huge amount of interest in this space. I mean, there's already billions of web impressions on the internet and on social media sites, billions that talk about the vagus nerve. And as we now begin to see the power of specifically targeting these vagus nerve fibers to suppress inflammation, it's going to create even more interest.
Nice, nice. I'm really excited to hear that. And just like not to sound like futile, but like could you also describe how the implants actually would look for people listening or people watching on Instagram or YouTube or anywhere else? Like if they're wondering, okay, this sounds really great, but what does it actually look like? Are these like big implants? Are they very small implants? Like how long can people have these implants within their bodies, Doc?
The implant's very small. It's about the size of a multivitamin. It's fully contained with an ASIC and a battery and an antenna and a lead. A neurosurgeon will implant it in the left neck at about the level of your Adam's apple, and it goes in through an incision about an inch or an inch and a half long through an operation that is a same day surgery. So you come in the
Well,
morning and you go home in the afternoon.
wow,
The,
wow,
the,
that's
the
exciting.
it's very interesting. It's very powerful device. It delivers about 400 microamps of current for about 1 minute a day. And that's a remarkable effect of the nervous system having an amplification of a signal that after only 1 minute, the downstream benefits can last for 12 to 24 hours. The subjects, I've met several patients from the clinical trial. The clinical trial is you can find most of the clinical trial results on the SetPoint Medical website. It's easy to find, but in summary, there were 242 patients in the clinical trial. The trial was performed at multiple sites, more than 40 sites all across the United States. And all the subjects received this implant in their left neck at the beginning of the study. All of the subjects had serious uh, signs and symptoms, pain of rheumatoid arthritis and dysfunction, despite the fact that they had been trying these very powerful immunosuppressive drugs like the biologics and like the JAKs. So they were kind of running out of options. When the study began, the device was only turned on in half of the patients. They were randomized. And within 3 months, the treated group, the ones that had their device turned on, within 3 months, they had reached the primary endpoint with statistical significance in the clinical trial. Then at the end of that 3 months, the other group, the group that had had the device implanted but not yet turned on, those devices got turned on. And those patients caught up to the treated group within a few months. And by the end of 1 year, 75% of all the patients in the trial were using the immunoregulator, the device, as their primary therapy without using biologics or JAKs. And so, because the biologics and JAKs have so many side effects, they have what's called a black box warning, which is the most dangerous side effect warning the FDA can give. The patients were really happy to not have to be on those drugs, and 75% of them were only being treated with the vagus nerve device called the immunoregulator.
Well, that's really exciting, really, and I think it's compared to obviously because I have also got I have a good well I have a huge interest in this kind of like like sort of like bioelectric simulations that or stimulations that are being done on the human body to reduce pain, and I'm really happy to hear that you say this would actually implant it in the neck. And like the next question that I was going to ask you was, like in terms of the challenges you're facing, but before we even go there, I know like there's been some other concepts that sort of like a kind of in the market or sort of like on the way to market where people are also looking to do implants in the spinal nerves in the spinal cord, for example, to try to regulate pain. So and by sort of like intercepting those like receptors from the brain to whatever part of the body they might be trying to work with. Obviously your I think your approach is a lot easier, a lot safer because it doesn't have to it's nowhere near the spine. It's focusing only on the vagus nerve. But I don't know, what do you think on those other approaches, Doc? Do you think this is something as well that could also be implanted in different parts of the body, or is it specifically the vagus nerve?
So I am not an expert on the spinal cord devices or on pain. And I think if we go back to what we talked about before, in the context of bioelectronic medicine, we're looking at a very specific series of molecular, neuroscientific, neurophysiological steps that culminate in a drug target. In the case of rheumatoid arthritis, the drug target would be cytokines. And so what we've done is we've specifically mapped the molecular mechanisms in the vagus nerve that downregulate how white blood cells make cytokines. Now, cytokines go by names like TNF and IL-1 and IL-6. And drugs that treat inflammation, they are biologics, monoclonal antibodies, and other proteins that that stick to the cytokines TNF, IL-1, and IL-6, and they take them out of action. They inhibit them, they neutralize them. So these are known therapeutic strategies to treat inflammation by using drugs, in the case of biologics, that reduce the activity of the cytokines. What we've shown is that with vagus nerve stimulation, that the signals traveling in the nerve fibers that terminate in the spleen, those signals turn off the white blood cell's ability to make cytokines. But here's the difference. The biologics are blocking, inhibiting 100% of the cytokine activity. So that's why they cause immunosuppression. And this immunosuppression is actually a dangerous side effect. The vagus nerve stimulation with the immunoregulator, that does not block 100% of the cytokines. It lowers it from toxic levels, say 90% max, down to 20% max, 30% max. It doesn't block 100%. And therefore, you retain some amount of inflammation, which you need to be healthy. So I just gave a fairly detailed explanation to point out that we really understand the mechanisms of how the vagus nerve controls inflammation. And if you have inflammation, inflammation can cause pain. But that's very, very different than developing a device to target the spinal column to send signals into the pain networks in the brain, which are very incompletely understood. There's a lot of controversy on the mechanisms of what causes pain, why we experience pain. and how to best treat pain. So the vagus nerve stimulator is targeting inflammation per
Sure.
se, not pain.
All right. Thank you very much for clarifying that. And yeah, it's quite exciting. I'm just fascinated with how far the technology is coming. And but now, obviously, that you guys have gotten the FDA approval, I'm sure that's a huge milestone. Like, what would you say are the sort of like the biggest hurdles that you're facing next, now going onwards?
Well, I think we should be very clear that it's a huge milestone for the company, for SetPoint Medical, to have accomplished this FDA approval for their product, and I think it bears a little explaining. So from the time that the company started back in 2007 and licensed the technology from my lab to begin building the device, they did everything. They had to design the device, they had to build the device, they had to get the device, get permission to study the device in humans after they studied it in animals. They had to then do pilot clinical trials of the device. And some of those were done in Europe, some of them were done in the United States. And ultimately, they had to design and implement a clinical trial, which is the one we were just talking about in the 242 patients, which was announced last November in Washington, D.C. at the American College of Rheumatology. When you look at that, Ronnie, you look at how many people touched that program, how many hundreds of millions of dollars had to be invested to do all that work over all those years, which stretches back what, almost 18 years now to do that project. And that doesn't count the time in my laboratory before that, the 10 years before that, where we did the science that worked out what why this should be plausible or feasible, and why. So when I look at where we are today with this FDA approval, first of all, you can't say enough about all the people at SetPoint Medical, the ones who are there now who did all this current work, and the ones that came before them that laid some of the groundwork. And you can't say enough about all the scientists who worked in the laboratories before there even was a company, and the scientists around the world who continue to study this as interesting interesting idea even now. I think there are literally hundreds of labs that in one way or another are touching this story. And so the good news there is with all these people working and with a new FDA approved product being launched, I think you're going to see tremendous interest in this going forward, and for lots of different reasons.
True, true. Would you say now your biggest worry or your biggest headache next now is more on the logistics side in terms of distribution? Are you gonna get it to as many patients as possible? And coordinating all of that, because I know that's also takes a lot of planning, a lot of like sort of like partnerships might have to form and things like that. Would you say that's the next biggest headache for SetPoint Medical?
The That's it again. You're asking a specific company question, and I don't work in the company, so that'd be a good question for the company. I can say that in the history of medicine, there is often a resistance to a truly new idea, which is why I wrote my book. I wrote a book which is called The Great Nerve, and it tells the story of the what we're talking about here today, about how the vagus nerve can turn off inflammation, and how from understanding that it's possible now to develop devices to treat rheumatoid arthritis by blocking inflammation and stimulating the vagus nerve. Now, what's so interesting about your comment is that you're absolutely right. In the history of medicine, when something's truly new, it takes a long time after the science is done, after the regulatory approvals are in place, and sometimes even after all the payment structures are reestablished. Because look, you don't want your doctor chasing every shiny object. You want people to be you want people to be careful and thoughtful and go very systematically forward. But I think this is going to be a little different for a few
Nice.
reasons. So, first, patients are already looking for this. I get emails now every single day from people who
Wow.
want to know how they can get, they have rheumatoid arthritis and they want to have a device, an immunoregulator implanted, and they want it right away because they can't afford the drugs or they're afraid of the immunosuppressing side effects of the drug. So there's a
Mm.
huge, already there's a huge, I'll tell you how big the patient interest is. They
Yeah.
needed SetPoint needed 242 patients in the clinical trial over the last few years, and they had tens of thousands. I believe it
Wow.
was around 30,000 patients
Wow.
logged into their portal and filled out all this detailed information. It wasn't like click one box and wait and see if we call you. They they worked through the portal
Yes.
30,000 people. So that tells you that's an objective indicator that people are looking for other options. And so I think that will drive change. And the other thing that's really important here, two more things. One is the safety profile is established already as safer than the current FDA approved biologics. But in addition, we have a 30 or 35-year experience implanting vagus nerve stimulators for epilepsy and depression. And so I estimate 1 million people worldwide have been implanted. And we know that vagus nerve stimulation does not cause increased risks of infection or sepsis or cancer or immunosuppression. So this isn't some completely newfangled thing where we know nothing about the risks. We know a lot about the risks and it's safe. And and finally, the other thing that I think will drive this, hopefully sooner rather than later, is that we know how it works. If you look at many drugs, including the biologics, you can Google it right now, and there's no consensus agreement about how these biologics uh, work in patients. And I'll give you an example. You can have two biologics that both hit TNF as their target. One of them works in one patient and another works in another patient, but they don't work in when you cross them back over. Why is that? If the mechanism of action is blocking TNF, they should work the same, and they don't. So we don't completely understand the drugs. We understand a tremendous amount about the mechanisms and the signaling pathways and the reasons why vagus nerve stimulation suppresses inflammation. So when you put those things together, and I explained this as best I could in the Great Nerve, you actually have a recipe for this therapy to be adopted much more quickly than historically.
Well, no, that's amazing, and no, thank you very much for the answer. And I think it's just really exciting, really, for anyone listening to this. And obviously, the sort of like the last question, or towards going towards the end of of our episode, Doc, is that I always tend to ask people that come on the podcast in terms of like what do you think the current state is versus where you think we're going. And this is like a question that you like, it's an open-ended question. It's like you can go as sci-fi as much as you want, because for most people, when they hear the products that come on the podcast, like similar to yours, that's got an approval 10 days ago from the FDA, it really sounds so futuristic. For most people, they're already thinking, okay, I didn't know we're here yet. Now, okay, so now since we're already here, in terms of our technological advancements, like what's the future then? Like, do you know where we're going? And what would your take be on that?
It's interesting as a neurosurgeon, as a scientist. I don't like to try to predict the future. I like to be data driven.
Yes.
Most scientists are like that, but it's not predicting the future if you understand the present, right? So if you know the surface area of a pond, and you know the surface area of a pond lily, and you know the doubling time of the pond lily, and you know the percentage of the pond that's covered in pond lilies today, you can make a pretty precise calculation, everything else being equal, for when the pond will be covered in pond lilies. And so that's not really predicting the future. That's understanding how things work today and where we are today. And when you apply that to where we are today with bioelectronic medicine and with vagus nerve stimulation to treat inflammation, I see in the coming years, not decades, but years, I see an explosion of interest in this, and I see many new conditions being treated, if not primarily by vagus nerve stimulation, at least as an adjunct. So cancer is a good example, right? So there's many forms of cancer are made worse by underlying inflammation. And we don't understand that very well, but if we could eradicate the inflammation, we might be able to slow the tumor growth in some of these cancers and give the other therapies a better chance of succeeding. So I think you're going to see an explosion of interest, more research, of course, more clinical studies in a whole range of conditions, going from cancer to Alzheimer's disease, to diabetes, to obesity, metabolic syndrome, to cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease, whether it's heart attack or stroke, those are conditions caused by chronic inflammation in the arteries and blood vessels. Imagine if you're in a high risk family for heart disease, and imagine if you could be safely treated with a chip, and if you could be safely treated with a small implant in your neck that is an immunoregulator that reduces the inflammation in your arteries. Now, we don't know this yet. This is a hypothesis. This is a futuristic experiment. But if you could reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke by having a multivitamin sized computer implanted in your neck, you would probably do it. You'd probably sign up. So I think these kind of things are going to happen fast. They're going to gain traction in at first in rheumatoid arthritis and other autoimmune conditions, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, psoriatic arthritis, some of the lupus, maybe some of these other autoimmune conditions. But after that, I do see a time sooner rather than later when these ideas will be tested and proven in a lot of other conditions.
Well, no, that's really exciting, and yeah, no, I thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Doc. I think it's quite exciting, and I can't wait to release this episode. And also, I think I got a copy of your book as well, so I'll be looking forward to reading that as well. And for anyone listening, like I'll also be putting the descriptions and everything else on top of the video on YouTube, or some links or in the description links below as well. I'll also be putting some links as well to also help you get more information on this. But yeah, thank you very much, Doc, for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Randy, for having me on, and congratulations for all the good that you're doing by getting the word of these things out. Kudos to you too.
Thank you.